She was 55 years old, and she was racing to grow an orchard she already knew she would never live to harvest. That was the thing the boy could not understand, standing at her gate that cold morning. He saw an old woman on her knees in half-frozen ground, pressing warm beeswax over a wound she had cut into a tree no taller than himself, and could not work out why anyone would labor so over something that would not feed her for 10 years yet. He did not know she had counted those 10 years against her own, and come up short, and gone on grafting anyway. Hannah Price did not look up at first. A thing half-grafted cannot wait on manners. The boy stood at the gate a long while, and the longer he stood, the worse the stillness got. Thin as a fence rail, a bedroll across his shoulders, his boots gone soft at the toes from too many miles, and behind his eyes no destination at all, only the cornered, hunted flatness of someone who has nowhere left to go and knows it. She was a widow 7 years now, and if there was one thing the frontier had taught her to read at a glance, it was that look, the look of a person who had simply run out of places to be. "You hungry?" she asked the tree. Then, the same flat way, she asked the boy. He shifted his weight. "I can work." It was not the same as yes, but it was close enough, and she had learned long ago that pride was the last thing a hungry person would set down. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood, slow, the way the cold made her stand now, one knuckle pressed to the small of her back. "Then mind the gate behind you," she said. "The deer come down off the ridge at dusk, and they'll strip everything I've planted in a single night, if you leave it gaping. There's cornbread and a little salt pork on the board inside. Eat, then you can earn it carrying water." He ate like a creature that did not trust food to stay where it was put. His name was Eli. He was 17, and he would not say from where, and she did not press him, because some words come up out of a person the way sap comes up a tree, only in their own season, and never before. That first night he slept in the lean-to off the barn. She heard him through the wall, the restless turning of someone braced for a hand on his collar in the dark. She lay awake a while herself, an old woman alone on a hillside with 8 rows of trees that would not feed her and a strange boy under her roof, and she thought, not for the first time, that the Lord had a peculiar way of sending you the things you needed dressed up as the things you hadn't asked for. The orchard was the only thing Hannah owned that frightened her neighbors a little. 8 rows of slim trees on the south slope, staked straight, mulched against the frost, every one of them tended like a sick child, and not a single one would give so much as 1 apple for years yet. To the people of the valley it looked like a woman planting a garden for ghosts. They grew what they could put on a table by autumn, and a tree you nursed for the better part of a decade before it paid you back struck them as something close to vanity or grief or both. No one said so as plainly as Caleb Doss. He farmed the next claim over, and he had no patience for anything that did not pay this season, not cruel. She had decided long ago, but cured to leather by too many bad winters and one grief he never spoke of. He raised cattle because cattle could be counted, branded, driven, and sold in the fall, and the money was real, and you held it in your hand. He came around that second morning while the boy was still hauling water, and he leaned on her fence the way he did, hat pushed back. "You're a sensible woman, Hannah," he said, "in most things, which is why this beats me. You're past 50. Those trees of yours won't bear a real crop for, 8 years? 10? Who do you reckon is going to be standing here doing the picking?" "Somebody," she said. She did not stop working. "Not you. Likely not me." She had a scion held against a cut stock, her thumb steadying it. "But somebody." Caleb shook his head slow, like she was a sum that wouldn't come out right. "Cattle, Hannah. A man can count cattle. You can't count a tree that isn't there. You're spending real years you don't have spare, on apples you'll never see." "No," she agreed, mild as milk. "You count these later. After you're gone. Somebody else does the counting." She glanced up at him. and there was something in her face that was not quite an argument. It must be a comfort, Caleb, to need so little from the world that you can have it all by Christmas. He looked past her at the boy hauling the buckets, and his mouth went thin. And now you've taken in a stray to feed on top of it. You'll wake up one morning, Hannah, and find your gate open and your good knife gone and that boy 3 counties off. Mark me. I'll mark you, she said. I always do. Doesn't mean I'll mind you. He didn't have an answer for that. He never did to that kind of thing. So he tipped his hat and left, which was how most of their conversations ended in those days, him retreating, her watching him go, neither of them quite admitting that he came around an awful lot for a man who thought she was a fool. The boy did not run off. The knife stayed where she kept it. But she saw how Caleb's words had landed on him, saw the boy go quiet and careful for a few days, like a dog that has learned the shape of a raised hand. So on the 3rd evening, her hands moving as she talked, peeling a thin curl of bark off a scrap of wood, she told him how she had come to grafting. She'd learned it as a girl from an old man named Moses Tarn, the orchardist who kept the first real apple trees west of the pass, back when the valley was little more than a wagon track and a dream. He'd say a thing I never managed to forget. Anybody can drop a seed in the dirt and wait. But an apple is a liar, girl. Plant the seed of the sweetest apple you ever ate in your life, and the tree it makes will likely give you something small and sour you'd be ashamed to feed the hogs. Ely frowned. Why would it lie? Because the seed does not keep its mother's promise. There's 100 fathers in an apple seed. Every other tree the bees flew through that spring. You plant it. It's a fresh roll of the dice. She set the wood down. So Moses taught me the honest way. You take a cutting, a scion, he called it, a slim pencil of last year's growth off a tree whose fruit you've tasted and trusted, and you marry it to the roots of another tree entirely. Those roots are the rootstock, the part that holds and feeds and decides whether the whole thing stands a hard winter. The scion's the promise, the sweetness you'll one day put in your mouth. She pressed her 2 scraps of wood face to face. Bind the green of one against the green of the other, true, and in time the wound heals into a single tree, one that gives you back exactly the apple you asked it for. And that's not a gamble, Eli said slowly. That's the whole point. You're not growing a tree. You're keeping a word somebody already gave you. Some fellow you never met grew that good apple first. You're just passing his word down the line. Her hands stilled. Moses has been dead 9 springs, buried under a wild crab he never bothered to graft, which he'd have found funny. I keep his word the only way I know, on my knees in the cold, with a knife and a tin of wax, year after year. Eli was quiet a long moment. Nobody ever passed me anything, he said. No, she said. Well, we'll see about that. A week became a month, and a month became the kind of arrangement nobody bothered to put words to. Ellie mended the gate and split a winter's wood and learned where the deer broke through. He was clumsy with the trees at first, all wrong angles, split bark. Scions snapped clean off because he gripped them like he was afraid they'd run, but he had quiet hands once he stopped being afraid of them, and he watched her work with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. She taught him in the last of winter, because that was the season for it. The joining done before the buds woke, so the wound could heal into a union before the whole tree roused up and demanded to grow. This is a whip graft, she told him, turning the blade so he could follow it. The cut is everything. Get it wrong, and you've killed both halves at once. Long sloping cut on the scion. 1 stroke. You don't saw at it. Then the very same cut on the stalk. So the 2 faces match. She made a second small cut into each, a notch partway down. That's the tongue. Hook them together so. She fit the 2 pieces, the tongue sliding home until they sat snug as one piece of wood, and she saw the fear go out of his face and something else come up under it. The startled lift of a boy who had just felt a thing go right in his hands for once. then the wax. She pressed the warmed beeswax over the joint with her thumb and bound it round with cloth tape, firm. Seals the wound, keeps the air and wet out, gives the two a fighting chance to grow into one before anything can rot the seam. That's the whole of it, Eli. A clean cut and patience. There's no trick in this world that lets you hurry the healing. It takes the time it takes. He ruined the first 3. The bark tore, or the cut went crooked, or his hand shook and the tongues wouldn't catch. He swore under his breath, soft, the way a boy swears was been hit for it before, and she pretended not to hear. The 4th one held. He sat back on his heels with the bound little tree in his 2 hands and looked at it like it had spoken to him out loud. And Hannah, watching the boy's face go open like that, felt something move in her own chest, something she had been certain for 7 years was finished moving for good. It came out of him, slow, the way she'd known it would, and not all at once. A peace came one evening when a peddler's wagon rattled up the valley road and Eli went still as a hare, every muscle in him strung to bolt, until the wagon passed the gate without slowing. A peace came when she scolded him, mildly, over a gate left unpinned, and watched him flinch his whole body sideways before he caught himself. The rest came the night the spring rain kept them both inside, the cabin gone amber and close around the fire. His mother had died when he was small. His father had taken to drink and then to the back of his hand, and there had been a stepmother after who had no use for another mouth, and a winter when he was 13 when they had simply stopped setting him a place at the board until he understood and left. After that it had been work where he could find it, and a ditch where he couldn't, and men who paid him in cuffs as often as coin, and a long, slow education in the one lesson the world seemed determined to teach him, that he was a thing you used until it wore out, and then you left it in the road. Nobody ever told me to be anything but gone, he said, so low she almost missed it. Hannah did not reach for him. She had learned that a creature beaten that often does not want a hand coming at its face, even a kind one. She just set the poker in his grip and let him tend the fire, which was its own kind of telling him to stay. You know what a rootstock is? No, she said after a while. He looked up, not following. The roots, the part nobody ever tastes and nobody ever praises, the part that just holds and feeds and decides whether the whole thing lives through the winter. A person can get one of those late, Eli. Most folks are born onto theirs. Some of us have to go find ours out on the road. Doesn't make the tree any less true once it takes. The graft doesn't care which way you came to it. It only cares that the cut was clean and somebody held the 2 halves together long enough to knit. He didn't answer, but he tended the fire a long time, and he did not sleep braced to run that night, and in the morning the gate was pinned exactly as she'd taught him. Caleb came back in the early spring driving a wagon, and in the bed of it lay a great bundle of nameless seedling apple whips, trees grown straight from pips, no graft anywhere in them, bought cheap off a peddler passing through to the coast. Half the price of yours, he announced, so pleased with himself it was almost dear. I'll have an orchard same as you, Hannah Price, and save myself a fair $1 getting it. You've made grafting out to be some holy mystery. Turns out a man can just buy trees. Hannah looked down at the tangle of bare roots, and for a moment she felt nothing so much as tenderness for him, which surprised her. You'll have an orchard. What you won't have is the first idea what kind. Not till the day each one finally fruits, and by then you'll have spent the same 8 years I have. Apples is apples. Apples are not apples. She lifted one of the whips and turned it in her hand. This one might give you a fine, sweet-eating apple. The next might give you green knots so sour they're not fit for cider, and you'll have fed and pruned and waited on it just the same. You're betting 8 years of your one life that the dirt will happen to be kind to you. And you're not betting? He said it sharp, but he was listening. He always listened to her, under the scorn. I'm not betting at all. That's the whole of the difference. Every tree up there carries the fruit of a tree I put in my own mouth and chose. I'm not hoping for a good apple. I already know exactly which one each will be. The seed forgets, the graft remembers. Then Eli, who had been listening from the woodpile, did a thing that surprised them both. He came forward. "I could graft them for you," he said to Caleb. The words came out rough. It was the most she'd ever heard him say to a grown man. "Cut your seedlings off above the root and put a named scion on each. Then you'd have the cheap roots and the sure apple both. You'd lose a year while they knit, but you'd know what you were growing." Caleb stared at the boy as though the woodpile itself had spoken. For a moment Hannah thought he might laugh, that hard, reflexive scorn rising in him out of pure habit. She saw him master it. She saw, too, that the offer had landed somewhere it stung, that a stray off the road had just offered to give him for nothing the one thing his cheap bargain couldn't buy. "When I want a drifter to tell me my business," Caleb said, "I'll send up smoke." And he clucked to his horse and planted his cheap seedlings anyway, all down his good south fence line, because Caleb Doss was not, and never had been, a man who could be told. But he had heard the boy. And Hannah, banking the fire that night, thought that two things had taken root that day that hadn't been there the morning before, and that neither of them had a thing to do with apples. She found it on a warm, wet morning in the heart of summer, and it stopped her heart for a beat. The tips of the new growth on 3 trees in the 5th row, gone black and bent, curled over at the end like a shepherd's crook. The leaves scorched as though a fire had passed an inch above them and singed only the new wood. She knew it the moment she saw it. Fire blight, the rot that ran in warm, wet weather. That climbed down a branch from the bloom end toward the trunk, and, if it reached the trunk, would take the whole tree and leap to the next. "Get me the saw and the lamp oil," she told Eli, and her voice was flat in the way that frightened him more than shouting would have. "And don't you touch a single sound tree with the blade once you've touched a sick one. Not one. This thing rides from tree to tree on the steel itself." They worked through the heat of the day. She showed him how to cut, not at the black, but a long handspan down into the clean green wood below it, because the poison ran ahead of what the eye could see, and every cut she made him wipe the blade in oil before it touched live wood again. "Why so far down?" he asked, sweat tracking through the dirt on his face. "Because the seen edge of a wound is a liar, too. Same as the seed. The troubles always run further than it shows. Cut where you can see the rot. You've left the rot behind in what's still standing. Cut a hand below clean. Burn what you took. And maybe you've saved the rest." She fed the blackened cuttings into a fire well downwind and watched them curl. "You cut deep and you cut early, or you lose the orchard one row at a time." They saved 4 of the 5 afflicted trees. The 5th she took out at the root and burned entire, and she did not let herself grieve it where the boy could see. That evening Caleb came up to the fence. He'd seen the smoke and feared a grass fire, and found her gray and spent on the porch step, the smell of char in her hair. "Lose much?" he asked, gruff. "1 tree. Could have been all of them." She looked at him. "It's a thing your seedlings can take too, Caleb, when the weather turns wet and warm. You see a tip go black and crook over like a question mark. You cut a hand below clean. Burn what you take and wipe your saw in oil between every cut, or you'll carry the death down the whole row yourself." He stood there a moment. Then stiffly, like the words cost him coin. "How far below?" "A good hand's width into the green." She almost smiled, too tired to hide it. "Well, look at that. Caleb Doss asking me a question with no scorn in it." "Don't get used to it," he said. But he went home and walked his own rows in the last light, peering at every bloom end, and she watched him go and thought the man had finally found one thing in this world he could not count, brand, or sell, and that it had taken a death, 2 claims, over to teach him to fear it. The cold came down out of the Cascades that next year like something with a grudge. It came early and mean, a hard black freeze with no snow over it to blanket the ground, and it found everything that wasn't ready. It killed Caleb's seedlings down to the very root, cheap unnamed stock, no hardiness chosen into it, no tough roots picked to stand a freeze. They were a gamble in every part. In that winter, the gamble came up empty. His whole fence line went brown and brittle and dead. It took 3 of Hannah's grafted trees too, the youngest, the ones whose unions hadn't yet grown strong. She walked the rows in the gray morning after and found them blackened, and the loss sat on her harder than she let the boy see. She was old now. The years she had left to spend were not so many, and to lose 3 of them to a single bad night of frost felt like being robbed in a year she could least afford it. And that was the winter she got sick. It started as the cough everyone got, and it did not stop being that. It went down into her chest and took root there, a wet, rattling thing that left her gray and breathless on the edge of the bed of a morning. The doctor came up from the valley town, listened, frowned, and said what doctors said in those years, which was mostly nothing dressed in long words. He left a bottle of something brown and useless and drove his buggy back down the hill. Ely was 18 by then, and frightened in a way he didn't have words for. He did her chores and his own, and sat outside her door at night, and she heard him out there and hadn't the breath to tell him to go to bed. And Caleb came. She had not expected that. He came up through the dead, brown ruin of his own orchard and stood in her doorway, turning his hat round and round in his big hands, this hard man who counted cattle and needed nothing. And for a long while he couldn't get the words out at all. "I lost the whole bunch," he said finally. "Every last seedling, not one came through," he swallowed. "You were right, Hannah, and I was a stubborn old fool, and I came to say it." While there was still, he stopped dead. He had been about to say while there was still time, and they both heard the rest of it land in the room, and he had the grace to go red and look at the floor. Hannah, propped up on her pillows, gray as ash and tired to her soul, found she had enough breath left to laugh, just a little. "Sit down, Caleb Doss. You've surely earned a chair if you've finally gone and earned yourself some sense." He sat. He stayed past dark, and he came back the next day, and the day after that, and it stopped being about the orchard at all. She did not die that winter. The cough loosened by the slow degrees of early spring and let her go, mostly, though it left her smaller and easier tired, and they both understood without saying so that it had only let her go for a while. But in the weeks of it, something had quietly changed shape in the cabin on the hill, and neither of them was young enough to be coy about it. Caleb came every day now. He brought her broth he'd ruined, and then a second pot he'd ruined less. He learned to be still in a chair, which for him was a labor like breaking a horse. And one gray afternoon, with the rain on the roof and the boy off seeing to the stock, he told her the thing he had never told a living soul. "I had a wife," he said, turning a tin cup in his hands and not looking at her, back east, Sarah. "And a boy. He'd have been near your Eli's age if fever came through the spring before we'd have come west. Took to both of them inside of 1 week. I buried them under a young elm I'd set out the year we married, and then I got up off my knees and came west and made myself a promise on that road that I've kept 20 years. "What promise?" Hannah said softly. "That I'd never again own a single thing I couldn't sell before the winter came for it. Cattle you can sell. A man can't lose what he's already turned to money in his hand. I built a whole life on that. And then I came over that fence and saw you, old as me, alone as me, with no more years to spare than I've got, pouring every one of them into trees you told me straight out you'd never live to pick from." His voice roughened. "And I couldn't stand to look at it, because you were braver than me, and I knew it, and I called it foolishness so I wouldn't have to call it that." "It's not bravery," Hannah said. She reached over and put her worn hand on his worn hand, the first time, and felt how it trembled. "It's just refusing to act like the world ends with me. You buried your sweetness under that elm and stood guard over the grave 20 years. I just planted mine out in the open where the frost could get it. That's the only difference between us." He turned his hand over under hers, slow, and closed it round her fingers, and the two of them sat in the rain light a long while saying nothing at all. Two old people who had each spent 20 years being right about the wrong thing. They were married that spring by the circuit preacher. Two old people on a green hillside, with Eli standing up beside them in his one clean shirt. No fuss to it and no fluttering, only a great quiet loosening in the both of them, the way a held breath finally goes out. What they felt was not the giddy thing the young feel, but something steadier, relief, plain and enormous, that the spending of the rest would not have to be done alone. She did not change her name. She'd carried Price too long when the trees were planted under it. Hannah said afterward, more than once, that this, late, against all counsel, had been worth more than 30 easy years of the expected kind. They had one good full year, the three of them, and in it, Caleb finally crossed the fence for good, not as a neighbor and not even as a husband, but as a man learning a trade 20 years too late and ashamed of how badly he wanted it. It started over a single tree. A wild seedling had come up on its own at the bottom corner of Caleb's dead orchard, the one volunteer the killing winter hadn't taken, hardy and tough and green. He'd taken to it the way a hard man takes to the one creature that doesn't ask anything of him, and he wanted to keep it. But Hannah tasted a windfall off it that fall and made a face that told him everything. Sour. Green and sour and mean. Good roots, though. Look how it came through that freeze when nothing else did. That's a fine, strong rootstock. It's only the apple that's no account. You graft it, Caleb. Keep those tough roots that beat the frost. Put a sweet sure scion up top. And you got a tree hard enough to live and sweet enough to be worth living. So that tail end of winter, Caleb Doss, 60 years old, hands like cracked harness leather, knelt in the cold beside his one tough volunteer and learned the whip and the tongue. Ellie cut the scions for him, slim pencils off Hannah's oldest and sweetest tree. His big hands, so sure on a rope or a brand, shook on the little blade exactly the way the boys had a year before, and he ruined too and swore the same soft swears. And Hannah sat bundled on a stool at the row's end and laughed at him until the cough took her and she had to stop. A clean cut and patience, she called. There's no trick that lets you hurry it, you contrary old man. The third graft Caleb got. He fit the long cuts true, the green pressed clean against the green, and he sealed it with the warm wax under his thumb, and then he knelt over it a long moment with his hat off and his head down, and Hannah understood he was not looking at a tree. "That one's for you," he said at last, not turning round. "When it bears, won't be for years yet." "No," Hannah agreed, gentle. "It won't be for years yet." And neither of them said the rest of it, because they didn't need to anymore. He had finally, at 60, planted a thing he might not live to pick from, and given it to a woman he knew he would likely outlive, and called that, at last, by its right name. When she felt the cough come creeping back the following winter, Hannah did not waste the strength she had on pretending. She called Eli to her bedside. He was 19 now, broad through the shoulders, a grown man where a starved boy had stood at her gate, his hands on a grafting knife as sure as her own had ever been. He sat where Caleb usually sat, already crying, which she would not have, and which she allowed anyway. "The trees on the south slope are yours. We'll see the lawyer and put it on paper proper. But that's not the part I mean. They're yours, the way Moses' tarns were mine. You'll do the picking. I won't live to do. And when these grow old, you'll cut scions off them and graft those onto fresh young roots. and the named apples I chose will go right on. Past these trees, past me, and one day past you too. I don't want to past you, Eli said, and his voice broke clean in half on it. That was never a choice put to either of us. She found his hand and held it. So listen, because I need you to carry this more than I need you to carry the trees. You don't plant an orchard for yourself. You plant it so someone you'll never meet, someone not even born, will stand in the shade of it one hot afternoon and bite into something sweet, and never once think of you. That's not the sad part, Eli. That's the whole reason. You spend your one short life planting a thing you'll never live to harvest, because somebody who came before did the very same for you. That's how the sweetness gets carried down the years. That's the only way it ever has. He couldn't answer. He just held her hand and nodded against it. And one more thing. Caleb came to all this late and scared. When I'm gone, the counting'll come back on him hard. It's the only language grief ever taught him. Don't let him sit alone with it. Put a knife in his hand of a winter and make him work beside you. A man with a graft to tend come spring can't grieve quite all the way down to the root. You understand me? Yes, ma'am, Eli managed. Good boy. She closed her eyes. You were the best graft I ever made, and I never even had to cut you. You came to me already needing roots. All I did was hold the two halves together till you knit. She nearly went that winter, and the thing that turned her back was not the doctor. It was the frost. Late in the cold, a clear, hard night came on, the kind that drops a killing freeze on new buds, and the trees on the south slope had broken bud early in a treacherous warm week. Ellie came in from checking the sky white-faced. A freeze like that could take a year's bearing wood off the youngest grafts and undo unions that hadn't finished knitting. Hannah rose up off the bed she had not left in 9 days. Hannah, no, lie down. Smudge fires, she said, already reaching for her shawl, breath whistling in her. Down the rows, damp wood banked low, more smoke than flame. You want the smoke to lie over the buds like a blanket and hold the warm to the ground. Moses saved a whole crop that way the year the river froze. Wait, Caleb, wet sacks. Go. They worked the dark hours, all three of them, the boy and the old man hauling and banking the smoldering fires, and the dying woman wrapped in 3 quilts on a chair they'd carried out for her, sitting at the crest of the rows by lamplight, calling down hoarse instruction. Bank that one lower. Damp it. You want smoke, not blaze. Move down. The cold pools at the bottom of the slope. That's where you'll lose them first. The smoke lay gray and low over the slope all the long night and held the worst of the cold off the buds. By the time the sun came up pale over the Cascades and burned the danger off, they had lost not a single tree. Ellie stood in the smoke haze, swaying on his feet, and Caleb sat down flat in the cold dirt and put his head in his hands, and Hannah, gray as the smoke and barely able to lift her arm, looked out over her unharmed rows and the 2 exhausted men who had saved them, and thought, there, that is what an orchard is for. She did not die that winter either. She lived to see those rescued buds open into bloom, and she lived past that, 4 more years past that bedside winter, longer than any doctor had promised her. It was in the last of those 4 years that she got the thing she had planted and never truly let herself expect. She lived long enough to taste the first true apple off the oldest of all her grafted trees. A hard, tart, plain little fruit she had married to its rootstock with her own 2 hands the better part of a decade before. Eli picked it and put it in her palm, and she stood in the row leaning on Caleb's arm, the both of them old as fence posts now, and she bit into it. It tasted exactly like the apple she had meant for it to be. She laughed the way she did, because of course it did. She had chosen it. The seed forgets, the graft remembers. There, she said, around the second bite, juice on her chin and not caring. 8 years and change. Right on its own, slow time, not a day before. You can't hurry it, and you can't fool it. You can only choose true and wait. She held the bitten apple out to Caleb. Taste the thing you said I'd never live to pick. He took it. He looked at it a long moment. This hard man who'd spent 20 years owning nothing he couldn't sell before winter, holding an apple grown off a promise made 10 years before it kept itself. Then he ate, and his weathered face did something it had not done in all the years she'd known him, and he had to look away up the slope to where the bloom was. Sour, he said thickly. Plain and tarred and honest, she corrected. Like everything worth keeping. She is buried at the very top of the rose, where the slope crests, where she can keep an eye on the gate she always feared would be left gaping. Caleb set the stone himself facing down the rose, so that anyone standing at her grave would be looking out over every tree she'd ever grafted, and so that she, if the dead see anything, would see them bare. Time-mess, Kip. 10 spurns on. 10 springs from that last winter. The south slope is white with bloom, and the orchard she would never see has grown into something she would not have dared to dream. Illy keeps it now, not 8 rows anymore, but better than 40, and every tail end of winter he is out among them with the knife and the wax, exactly as she showed him on a cold afternoon when he was a starved boy who'd been told only to be gone. Folks drive a long road now for his named apples. The sweet shore ones nobody else can promise. Time, Kip. 10 spurns on. Caleb is old now, and keeps no cattle. The counting all went out of him with her. But he did not sit alone with the grief, because Eli would not let him. Every winter the boy put a knife in the old man's hand and stood him in the rows, just as she'd asked, and there was always a little green left in him come spring. Time, Kip. 10 spurns on. He keeps one tree beside his own door above all the rest, the one he grafted himself, kneeling in the cold at 60 with his hat off. It bore at last, 3 springs after she was gone. And that is the cruelty he has never made his peace with, that the apple kept its promise, and she did not live to see it kept. Every autumn the likeness of it opens the old wound clean again. He sits beneath it in the long afternoons, an old man missing her down to the root, tasting a sweetness grown for 2. Time, Kip. 10 spurns on. He told the little girl once, the fearless 4-year-old in his lap, the only wisdom a hard man ever truly earns. Your grandmother planted whole rows of trees she knew for certain she'd never live to pick from. I thought it was the foolishest thing I ever saw a person do. Turned out it was the only smart thing any of us managed in this whole valley. I spent 20 years owning nothing I couldn't sell before winter. She owned a thing she couldn't sell at all. And it's the only thing either of us left behind that's still alive. Time, Skip. 10 spurns on. The girl didn't understand him. She was 4. She was watching a bee work the blossom over his head. But she will. One day far from now, some hot afternoon when she stands in the shade of a tree she did not plant and bites into the sweetness of it and feels, without knowing why, that she owes a debt to someone she'll never get to thank. And on that day she will take up a knife and a little wax and keep a word for someone she will never meet. There is no trick anywhere that lets you hurry the healing. You choose true. You cut clean. You hold the 2 halves together long enough to knit, and you wait out the years you may not have. And then you hand it on. You graft your one short life under roots that will outlast you, and you let the sweetness carry down. Senate and stelm.